Today I want to share with you a product review. This is one of the more unexpected, disappointing product reviews that I've done. Definitely this product didn't turn out the way I expected. Let me show you what I've got. When I was in Italy, I couldn't help myself. I had to try these watercolors made by Gallo, and I'm just opening them up today. I didn't want to open them on my trip because any watercolor that uses honey as a binder has a tendency to not dry very well. They stay fairly moist in the palette. They also can perhaps cause an issue when you're painting on plein air. If there are bees around, they're drawn to the honey in the paints. So I'm just opening them up now that I'm home. I chose the Lake Pigment set and haven't put them into my palette yet, so I'm just going to use some little glass bowls to lay them out so I have some color to work with. These are just little soy sauce bowls and handy little tools for working with puddles of color if you're wanting to squeeze it directly from the tube or mix multiple colors. Anytime you're wanting to work with some fresh pigment that you're not ready to add to your palette, having these little bowls on hand is really handy. I've also think for larger paintings to be able to make a big puddle of pigment is really nice. This is the Yellow Weld. Then we've got Cosmos Orange, Rose Madder, something called an Indigo Green, which I like the look of, an Indigo, and the Logwood Violet. I like the labeling on these. It feels like watercolor paper. So it's got a matte kind of finish, feels very natural, has a feeling of maybe the color on the tube is more accurate than you might see if you're seeing a label that's more custom printed. I'm not a big fan of swatching color. I would much prefer to get to know a color for more characteristics what it does as it's being swatched, but it is a start. This Yellow Weld is really interestingly kind of translucent. I'm not seeing the pigment load I would have expected. And I want to just comment, the one reason I chose the Lake color set was simply because I didn't have a lot of selection to choose from. I was at an art supply store in Milan, not the Gallo shop itself. And so what was available was just a handful of sets. There was a bigger set and I just couldn't justify the price, to tell you the truth. When did watercolor paint get so expensive? Interestingly, I'm not seeing a lot of pigment load in these. I'm actually kind of worried about that. Oh, now here's some color. Now that's more like it. The indigo is doing what indigo does. And then the Logwood Violet, which again has a little more kind of transparency to it. So I'm not seeing a heavy pigment saturation here, which is not what I expected. And maybe that's my own fault for not reading the labeling as well as I could have, because I'm just noticing here it says the Lake Pigment set features exclusive vibrant plant pigments expertly extracted by Lutea Couleurs Vegetales in Belgium. So what we're seeing then is a plant pigment set. Primarily, indigo would be too, although it is probably one of the most intense colors when you're talking about plant pigments. So plant pigments do tend to be a little bit more kind of ethereal, for lack of a better word, and possibly less lightfast as well. What I'm seeing on the tube is that the light fastness is rated as good. Not really sure what that means. I think that would be something to check the website for. It's also an interesting color palette if you're looking for a range of kind of a limited palette. If I'm working with these colors, it's going to be probably an old-fashioned kind of washy watercolor feel. Our red is kind of pale and earthy. Our yellow is very transparent. Our blue is quite intense, but it's also, when we dilute it, we're probably going to see kind of a gray tone to the blue. And so everything is kind of that softer, earthy kind of feel. So here we're just working with a diluted wash of the indigo. I'm going to work with it a little more intense as well. And this is where getting to know a color to me really comes to life. If I can see how the color wants to behave, and I'm going to have to squeeze more out. Because just trying to get a full saturation of the Rose Madder, you can see I'm just slurping it all up with this flat brush. Let's give the colors the chance to move together. I'm seeing some rather pretty kind of granulation in here, textural effects. I'm just tilting a little bit so I get a little bit more of that gravity helping the pigment to move. But you can see there's little grains in the residue of the pigment, and we're seeing that here as well. Looks like the orange is doing the same kind of settling that the rose madder did. It's a beautiful shade of orange. I like it. If you're a new painter, you might be struggling to master the materials as well as the techniques used in watercolor. It can be very difficult to know as a beginner. Are your supplies contributing to your struggle to learn technique? How do you know if you're not wasting your money? How do you choose products that are going to stand the test of time and support you well in your artistic practice? Art should be the most inclusive space in the world. You have the freedom to choose and use art supplies and to not apologize for what you have in your painting space. When I teach watercolor workshops, I often have students come having chosen supplies that they're going to struggle with, because there are supplies that make a difference. The paper you use is a huge one. The paint you use is going to make the difference between a wishy-washy watercolor result, maybe a chalky drying finish, or a rich saturation of paint and beautiful texture. The brush you're using is going to handle differently depending on what it's made of and the shape that it is. And so there is a learning process in not just wielding technique, but in understanding your materials. And you can feel free to start small and add to your supplies slowly and gradually. A great way to do this is by taking a workshop, looking over your instructor's shoulder, asking questions of the other artists in the workshop. I'm talking about this today because it's a passion for me to enable artists to feel confident when it comes to your materials as well as your technique. And I've got some tools to help you. In the description below the video, I've got a list of links for you to access. There's a link to a supply list that you can download and print, a link to one of my favorite videos on working with basic watercolor supplies, as well as a link to my beginner course, my Heart-Led Beginner Watercolor course, which is designed to help you embrace the process of painting in watercolor while also listening to that little inner voice. It's not a rigid process of learning technique, but rather something that is intuitive and interactive, noticing what the watercolor does and internalizing that so you take some ownership of the process. It's an exciting way to paint. It helps you paint from a loose perspective from the very get-go, and you're going to feel more free as an artist when you recognize just how much learning goes into even a simple exercise of splashing the paint around. So take a look at the art supplies you have. Think about some of the questions you have about whether or not, is it me? Is it my supplies? And then click down to the description below the video to grab those resources that I mentioned. Okay, let's get back to the video. I think in watercolor, it's actually really beneficial to think about the color as almost an animate thing. So when I'm thinking about how the color is moving on the page, what does it want to do is something I often think about. How does it want to be used? And that can be really helpful in creating an intuitive kind of way of working with your materials. Is it a color that looks really beautiful in full strength, full saturation? Does it respond really well to transparency and flow? Does it want to work with other colors and mingle with them? Or does it kind of try to keep its own identity or take over? another option. Indigo is a kind of a takeover kind of color. And you need one in every palette. That gives you some of the dynamic that makes your painting come to life when your colors have different character traits. So I've kind of missed my opportunity to use yellow in a way that kind of, sings out in the painting. I've just filled the page so quickly with other color. But I'm going to just lift up all of the yellow that I have here, add a little water to create some flow. but what you're going to see is probably going to feel very subtle. And truthfully, I like the idea of having a very transparent yellow in my palette because it can actually be really hard to find a transparent yellow. And it's especially hard to find a transparent yellow with good light fastness. More of the yellows that are available are kind of colors that fade really easily. Whether or not Gallow's rating of good light fastness for these plant pigments is an enduring description or not is something I need to get into a little bit more closely. I kind of like the way the yellow has kind of introduced itself into this line that I've drawn across the page. Even though it's a pale kind of weak color, would be a good way to describe it, it doesn't behave weakly on the page. It's asserting itself a little bit. Some of the pigment that I've placed has pushed back against other pigments on the page. If I add that yellow in here, close to my indigo, look at how it's pushing against the indigo there as I touch it on the page. There it goes. You can see it's actually making the indigo move kind of out of the way as it flows a little bit on the page. If I spatter, you can see those little droplets kind of flare out as well. And that's the relational kind of thinking I like to look for. What does the paint want to do? Those are aspects that I can use in planning my painting and in painting with that intuition that lets the paint do what it wants and trusts it to be beautiful as it does what it wants. Here's the green. Again, this is an earthy green. I think it would be really beautiful as I'm thinking of some of the greenery that's growing out in my backyard right now, some of the wild plants. There's one that kind of grows up all twisted and then unfurls, and just the stroke I created in the lines through it makes me think of that plant. So I think that's really interesting. I'm just going to tilt this direction and see what comes to mind. This kind of exploratory play, which doesn't have a plan, it's just an opportunity to work with color and shape and notice what's going on. This is where I do develop kind of sixth sense in terms of kind of knowing what's going to happen when the paint touches the paper. It's where I develop a sense of trust in a good outcome, even when the painting is not going to plan. All of the open-ended kind of exploratory play, it gives me an understanding of pigment, of water flow, and it gives me an openness to process. And all of that helps me paint with a sense of trust in the outcome and presence in the moment as well. I think this is where I'm going to struggle the most, is with this red. It's just such a diminutive color. It does not assert itself. You know, I've already squeezed out 2 good blobs of it, and it's lovely and delicate and beautiful. If I wanted to make it any richer, I'm going to really struggle. And I haven't touched the violet yet. Let's do that. Let's go there. Add a little more water. Takes a little water to give the color the ability to move on the paper. So I'm just smelling my paint right now. It smells like cleaning solution. Has a little bit of a piney smell, like Mr. Clean. I don't know. Now I've got this corner of the page. Let's put the violet in here. And then let's assert it into the wash as well. Really soft granulation in the sediment left behind here. So I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit sad about the lack of intensity in most of these colors. The hues themselves are beautiful, but I feel like I'm working really hard to use them at full strength, because full strength with these colors is not that dark. And so that limits what I can achieve with them. Maybe in building up some layers, letting this dry, and then maybe going back in to layer some of that red. Maybe then I can get the intensity that I like to have in my watercolors. And this might just be a situation where I've chosen the wrong palette for my style of painting. You know, we all get marketed to with art supplies all the time, and sometimes the things we're being sold don't live up to the hype, whether it's because it doesn't suit our style or because the quality just isn't there. And I don't want to be dismissive of Gallow's colors. I like the flow, and certainly the indigo had the intensity which I expected. I think really this was a situation of choosing lake pigments and not really thinking about what plant-derived pigments meant for my practice. But sometimes you're going to purchase something that you might have buyer's remorse over, and maybe that's the lesson here. If you do buy something that doesn't feel like a fit for your art practice, you have a few options. There's denial, keep using it, and that might actually be really good. You might discover some ways of using the product that inspire you, that encourage you to, improvise or work around the product's limitations in a way that, teaches you something new in maybe another area of your art practice. And that can be really kind of a cool thing to see. If you don't want to be in denial, if you're just not happy that you've purchased something that isn't seeming to be a fit for you, it might be a time to kind of pay it forward. Maybe there's someone else who could be using those products and either, not caring about the same things that you care about. Maybe there's somebody else who could benefit from what you have purchased, and you can pay it forward in that way. I have donated student grade art materials to clubs and schools, and little kids who go through a lot of supplies, they're going to use paint and paper with a lot more freedom than those of us who have to pay the bills. And so student grade materials that maybe didn't meet your expectations can still help a young person just embrace their love of creation. I also think that there's a lot of benefit in brush miles. Even when your supplies are not serving you in the way that you wanted them to, you can really find yourself growing in experience, in your artistic voice, if you just keep painting regardless of whatever your limitations happen to be. Going forward despite those limitations is really, I guess I'm saying it again, such a good way of adapting and developing resilience as an artist. And resilience is just finding new ways of doing things, perhaps ways other artists haven't even thought of yet. These Gallo pigments are really pretty, and I think by building up slow layers, this could be a really good paint for an artist who is using a more botanical style, and you're working in those finer glazes. For an artist like me who's very dependent on that first wash of intensity, so often I take my brush, load it with color, put a strong mark on the paper, and then dilute and flow it out. And that just doesn't work when your pigments are this kind of subtle and elusive. And so I can't be fully dismissive of these pigments. They're simply not intense enough for the way I like to paint. It's interesting because every time I do a product review, I'm reminded that we come to a new product, a new material with certain expectations. We hope it's going to do something for us. And when that product doesn't live up to those expectations, we have some options. First of all, it's just outright rejection. Is this just going to be something I just can't use, something that didn't live up to the hype? Or maybe my expectations need to be reframed a little bit. And it's been interesting because coming back to this painting after having completed it, I've realized that even though these pigments from Gallo were less saturated than I expected, they're still beautiful colors. They can create gorgeous paintings, but my expectation and my approach to them might need to change. And I've also recognized that what I expected didn't actually align with what the product was described as. So that's the other side of it, is this isn't a bad review because I was lied to about the product. These are pigments that can stand well with the other paints in my palette. It's just my understanding of the color that needed to change. I'm looking forward to, in future, trying other colors from Gallo with that higher saturation, that richer level of pigment that doesn't come from lake colors, that comes from some of the other types of pigment. And, having a more well-rounded review and choosing colors that align better with the kinds of painting that I like to do.